So, very good morning, grade 8. Sorry we can't be together, but hopefully we will be together next week. So, this is just a very basic introductory lesson on what we're going to be doing this term. I did touch on this last term, so there'll be a little bit of repetition, but basically, what we're looking at here was what is known as the scramble for Africa. And by that we mean the attempts by European countries, France, Britain in particular, to simply take over most of Africa. We're going to find a situation by 1914 where European colonies by force had taken over virtually the whole of Africa. In fact, there were only two independent African states by 1914, Ethiopia over there and Liberia over there. Other than that, as you can see from this map, mainly Britain down here in the south, and up here around Egypt, and also here Britain, the blue, had taken over huge parts of Africa, as had France in the red, and then perhaps smaller roles for Spain up here, Portugal, Angola, and Mozambique over here. And then we've got the Belgian Congo over there. For Belgium, Germany had what was then known as German South-West Africa, today Namibia, and German East Africa, today Tanganyika. And Italy also had Liberia and small colonies, Eritrea, etc. And we're going to look at how this came about. In order to do that, we just need to go through some of these words. I touched on them briefly last time when we introduced this. So there's been a massive change now to something called nationalism. And nationalism is the belief that your country is great and you will do anything to promote it, often to the detriment of other countries. So it's putting your country first. So nationalism on its own is not necessarily a bad thing. 120 million people died in World War I and World War II because of nationalism. But imperialism is something slightly different and even more sinister. Imperialism is extending your country's influence over other countries by force. I think that's the important. It's not always by force, but in most cases, you simply take over weaker countries because you can, in order to get certain things. And let's go to this slide over here. What these European powers wanted from these colonies that they took over, mainly in Africa, they wanted cheap raw materials. So the Industrial Revolution, as you know, has now happened. And throughout Europe's a very small geographically. So a country like Britain, for example, has very little land. So they would really lack raw materials, coal, wood, gold, minerals, you name it. And they would then take over weaker countries in order to get those raw materials, which they could then turn into manufactured goods in their own countries. So not only raw materials, they could then sell those goods, so it became a market for the goods that they produce. So literally they would take over Rhodesia, for example, and take out coal, take the coal back to Britain, use the coal to power the Industrial Revolution, to power factories, and sell the products that they made in these factories back to Rhodesia. Or they would take cocoa from German East Africa, they'd take the cocoa back to Germany, they'd turn the cocoa into chocolate in their factories, and then they would sell the chocolate all over the world, including back in German East Africa. So colonization is the process where European countries took over weaker countries, often by force, and those countries now then became colonies of the European powers. So if we have a look at this map now, this is a similar map to the one, just slightly different colors. The biggest one was Britain. Britain at this stage, we were a Dutch colony, but by the late 1800s, of course, we were a British colony. So you have South Africa, Swaziland, Bechuanaland, today Botswana, Southern Rhodesia, which is today Zimbabwe, Northern Rhodesia, today Zambia, Egypt, all the way up here. And then the second biggest one would be France, mainly in northwest Africa, but also Madagascar. And then you've got Belgium, which had probably the biggest the Belgian Congo in the center over here. Germans here and here, as mentioned. The Italians in Angola and Mozambique. And then little roles for the Spanish and the Italians, as we've seen. So we're going to look at how this came about. How was it possible that this came about? So in grade 6, you learned that European powers began to explore continents outside of Europe in search of trade and profit, glory, gold, etc. They had developed new technologies of navigation, and they now set off to discover. And discovering was fine. Taking over was something slightly different. Okay, they did not only explore and trade, they conquered and colonized on every continent. And by far the most important one was Africa in terms of the amount of land that they took. So during the late 19th century, i.e. the late 1800s, 1880, 1890, European powers conquered and colonized the land and controlled the lives of most people of Africa. Africans weren't given a say in this. Their land was simply taken over. So colonialism is the occupation and control of one nation by another. The colonization of Africa became known as the scramble for Africa because these greedy colonial powers were literally fighting with one another to get as much territory as they could. And it implies a frantic attempt to get colonies before other people could do that. By 1914, 7 European countries, Britain the most, then France, then Portugal, then Germany, then Belgium, and then Italy and Spain, had helped themselves to the whole African continent, as I said, except for 2 exceptions, which were Ethiopia and Liberia, who were still independent. The rest of Africa had sadly become colonies. So we have to understand, if we look at Africa in the 1800s, it was nothing like that. I'm just going to make this map a lot bigger. We would see that there were some colonies. In 1800, we were still, in fact, a Dutch colony down here, and there were some colonies, but Africa was largely independent. We know from what we've studied what was going on here in places like Timbuktu and Mali. A lot of northern Africa was Islamic, and there was lots of trade going along the east coast and throughout Saharan Africa. Okay. I'm going to allow you to read this yourself. I'm not going to read through that. Okay. So eventually what happened, a very, very important year in the scramble for Africa was 1884. A conference was called. A conference is where countries get together or people get together and they discuss things. And they held it in the German capital, Berlin. Sorry, I don't think it was a capital. I think it was a German city. So by 1914, 7 European countries had helped themselves to the whole continent. Sorry, this is something I've already read. Okay. So by the 1870s, European powers were competing for control of different parts of Africa. In 1884, the German Prime Minister, a guy by the name of Otto von Bismarck, invited the European countries to a big conference in Berlin, the capital city of Germany. Okay, it was the capital city. This is critical. No Africans were invited. They were going to literally decide amongst themselves who would take which part of Africa. European powers decided how they would divide up Africa without fighting with one another. They didn't see Africa as a threat because at this stage Africa was very militarily weak. What they didn't want to do is go to war with other European countries. So they unashamedly got together to carve out Africa for one another. This was known as the Scramble for Africa, and those countries, as mentioned, each took a piece of Africa. Britain and France in particular, to a lesser extent Germany, took the biggest pieces because they were the strongest European countries at the time. So they could demand a bigger slice of the pie, as it were. Okay, so here are the 2 main players at this stage. This guy here, we're going to do some work on him. His name is King Leopold of Belgium. He was the Belgian king. He referred specifically to Africa as a magnificent cake. We're going to come back on. So those were his words. King Leopold II of Belgium, he referred to Africa as a magnificent cake. And this is a picture of Otto von Bismarck, who was the Chancellor or Prime Minister of Germany. and he was the one who called the Berlin Conference. So King Leopold of Belgium made the statement that Africa is a magnificent cake which we can divide up, and Otto von Bismarck called the conference. Okay, this is a newspaper headline that appeared in Lagos, Nigeria after the Berlin Conference, and the Berlin Conference is the greatest robbery that the world had ever known. European countries simply decided which parts of Africa they would take over. They didn't even have the decency to have African representation at this meeting, and they stole land, because that is basically what colonization is. Right, so just to refresh, the process of taking over other countries is called colonization. The areas that the Europeans took over were called colonies. Colonization involves taking control of land and the people living on it, usually by force, and then the colonies become part of that European country's empire. So we now start talking about the British Empire. Not only Africa, Britain had Canada and Australia and New Zealand and Singapore, all over the world they had these colonies, and it was now part of their empire. France as well, mainly in Africa, many colonies. Africa was divided up into no less than 46 colonies. Okay, so what we're going to finish off, we're going to look at how to study cartoons. We've done this already, so this is a little bit of revision, but just a bit of revision on what to look for in a cartoon. Okay, so the first thing I want to say is cartoons need to be studied very carefully. Take time studying your cartoon. Don't rush it. Look at it. Think what the cartoonist is saying. Read any words on it. Read any captions and read any explanations on it carefully. Read it 2-3 times before you even look at the question, so that you can get a sense of the message the cartoonist is trying to convey. They are not necessarily funny, sometimes they are, but they are always drawn to make a point. They are making a point. So they're often very critical of something, and you've got to try work out what point the cartoonist is making. What are they criticizing? What point is the cartoonist trying to make? They are a very useful source of information for historians. They are very biased. I just want to write that down, because we know that they are biased, and that is in most cases a bad thing for historians. But in this case, it gives us the idea that it gives us a sense of what the cartoonist is thinking. So by their nature, they are very biased. Sometimes it's difficult to understand the message of the cartoon, particularly if you don't understand the history of the time. So it's always important to read through your textbook and understand the history of the time before attempting the cartoon. They do not show actual events. They usually have symbols that have meaning, other meanings. They're not meant literally. It's not a comic strip. It does not show a running series of drawings. It just shows one drawing, and that is expressing the viewpoint of the cartoonist about a particular event or time period. So I'm just going to give you a second to look at this one. This one appears in your book. It's called The Mad Scramble for Africa. And here we can see, if you just look at it, we've got Belgium, France, Spain, Portugal, Italy, Germany, Holland, and Great Britain. Both of them were fighting over South Africa, because by now South Africa didn't exist, but the Cape was a British colony, but prior to that it had been a Dutch colony. And now you ask yourself, look at their face, they're all sweating, they're all pulling, they're all trying to get their piece of Africa. Often look at facial expressions. Look how determined King Leopold looks over there. Look at the Italian guy with his wide eyes. Look at how they all look greedy, and they are all now trying to grab a piece of Africa. Okay, so you're now going to have a go. This is going to be your homework for today. In fact, you can start straight away. So this is a cartoon. So first read page 170 to 173 again, paying particular attention on how to read the historical cartoon. That's over there that we've already discussed. And then you're going to answer the question. So here is the So first of all, think who these powers would represent. Who does that person, who would that person be? And always remember to read the caption. Afrique is Africa in French. Okay, and then these are the questions that you're going to do. Here's the figure holding the knife. What event and in what year is the cartoon referring to? This cartoon is based on the words of another leader. Name the leader and quote his words. Do you think the words of this person used were right or wrong? Explain your answer. Name the countries of the 6 other figures around the table. It's half a mark each. How would you describe their expressions? Who was notably absent from the meeting? Not look that up if you don't understand what that means. Explain the point the cartoonist is making. Your answer should include whether you think the cartoonist was in favor of what the countries were doing or not. Okay, so that's important. Supply your own caption or heading for the cartoon. Number 9. In 2 sentences, very clear there, explain what colonialism was in your own words. You can look it up, but you must describe it in your own words in 2 sentences. And then a really challenging one, you've got to think a little bit laterally here. There are many idioms or sayings. An idiom is a saying like a rolling stone gathers no moss, or too many cooks spoil the broth. So try find an idiom that you think that could apply to this cartoon and colonialism. In general, it can reference a cake, I suppose, if it also applies to the cartoon. Pick one idiom and explain why you chose it. In other words, how that idiom would apply to this cartoon. So that must please be completed today. You've got until midnight today to submit it. I don't mind. Preferably, I prefer you to create your own doc. If you do, remember to please to put your name on it, because then I print it and I mark it and I give it back to you when you return to school. If, however, you want to do it straight in your book and take a photo of your work, I will then mark that. That's fine. But either way, please, it must be marked. It must be submitted before midnight today. We'll see you soon.